Hello and welcome to the 4th Annual Federal Research Update webinar. My name is Dr. Heather Brown and I'm the Director of Grant Writing and Publications at the University of Missouri-Columbia. Today's webinar is sponsored by the University of Missouri-Columbia, the National Association of College and University Business Officers, and the Florida High-Tech Corridor Council, an economic development initiative of the State University System of Florida. Thank you so much for joining us here today. As you know, we were delayed somewhat because of Hurricane Sandy and the closure of the federal government. And we hope that all of you who are in the affected areas are beginning to recover and that you are safe. And very glad that everyone else can join us today. Just a note that if you are unable to watch this webinar or have missed any of the earlier sessions, because we did have to start much earlier than expected, you can go to the website in about 2 weeks and the edited video will be uploaded there so you can access it at your convenience. And we will send you an email when that is ready to be looked at. Today, as we go through this presentation, if you have any technology problems or concerns or questions, please send an email to federalupdate@missouri.edu. And that's the same email address that you can use if you have a question that you'd like to ask our presenter. Again, that email address is federalupdate@missouri.edu. So let's get started here, and I am very pleased to introduce our next presenter. His name is Shai Akabas. Shai joined the Bipartisan Policy Center's Economic Policy Project in 2010. He staffed the Dominici-Rivlin Debt Reduction Task Force that same year, and then assisted visiting scholar Jerome Powell in his work on the federal debt ceiling in 2011. Prior to joining BPC, Shai worked as a satellite office director on New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg's 2009 campaign for re-election. He received his BA in Economics and History from Cornell University in January 2009. Let's turn it over to Shai.
Thanks very much for having me, Heather. And I work at as Heather mentioned, the Bipartisan Policy Center, which is a think tank here in Washington that focuses on bringing the two parties together on a variety of issues, from housing policy to healthcare policy to national security, and I work on the economic policy team. And as Heather mentioned, I focused on the Dominici-Rivlin Debt Reduction Task Force last year, which worked side by side with what many of you may have heard of, the Simpson-Bowles debt reduction group, and came out with a series of proposals for debt reduction. Since then, we've been working on the issues of economic growth and debt reduction simultaneously, and one of the major issues facing the country today after the elections is going to be the sequester, which many of you have probably heard of, and I believe has been mentioned in some of the other presentations. But I'm going to try to give you a little bit better insight into what the cuts actually are, what they mean for some specific programs, what the economic impacts will be, and what the political situation looks like right now. So to get started, just to summarize here, since it's a complicated topic, especially with some of the mechanics and numbers when those things get involved. So I'm going to try to go through some areas that I believe are a little less important for the audience quicker, and some areas slower. And that will leave time at the end for questions. If you have any areas that I've rushed through too fast, feel free to do so then. So we're going to take a look to put the sequester into context at the broader budget picture and the debt discussion that's going on over the last year or two in Washington. And then focus on what the definition of a sequester is and how it came about, how we got it. And then look at how it works and what the impacts will be. And then, as I mentioned, finally, we'll look a little bit at what the situation looks like here in Washington today. So to start with, I think this graph really gives the best overall picture of what the federal budget looks like. It divides it up into the entitlement programs, which are Medicare, Medicaid, on healthcare, Social Security, and what they call other mandatory spending that you see there in the blue. And other mandatory spending is a bunch of other smaller programs that are also entitlement programs. These are pensions to federal employees or farm programs where the government gives farmers payments, either direct or in other ways, and a bunch of other smaller programs. But those are also entitlement programs. The other two areas that you see there, the other two relatively large areas, are defense and non-defense discretionary spending. Those are the parts of the budget that Congress allocates on an annual basis, as opposed to the other programs that I just mentioned, which are on autopilot. Congress does not deal with those on an annual basis. Your Medicare benefits are in law for eternity unless Congress decides to change that law with the administration. And non-defense and defense get appropriated each year. That is where all grant funding comes from, the non-defense discretionary portion. And as you can see, it's a relatively small part of the budget, 17%. A lot of people talk about cutting the budget and how that will work towards deficit reduction. Many proposals that you hear are to cut foreign aid or waste, fraud, and abuse, and those will solve our budget problem. Foreign aid is really a tiny sliver of the non-defense discretionary section that you see there. It's about 1% or a little less than 1% of the whole budget. So cutting that or even eliminating that is going to provide very little help to our deficit and debt problems. This is essentially the same pie that shows you how much we are spending, but then it puts it in the context of how much money we're taking in and what our deficit is. So this means that the government is spending $3.63 trillion each year, or as of last year, this past year, and it is taking in $2.45 trillion in revenues from taxes or fees. And that leads to a deficit, meaning the difference between those two, of $1.18 trillion. That's a pretty large number. It is larger than most economies in the world, and it's larger than deficits that we've really had at any point in our history. This all really needs to be considered, though, in the context of the current weak recovery that we have. So we have two major macroeconomic issues right now. One is the weak recovery, the slow growth, and the other is this looming debt and deficit problem that, especially when you get to the later years, causes major issues for the country. If we continue to let the debt rack up, it will go on this trajectory that you see here, which is well over the size of our economy, which it passes in the middle of the next decade, and it will keep increasing. It'll accelerate thereafter because interest payments continue to grow faster and faster as we accumulate more and more debt. So that line obviously needs to be turned or leveled off at some point before we get to those later years that you see there. But it is not a problem that it does not start accelerating until the next decade. So we have time to phase in these changes, whatever they are that we make, as long as we do it relatively soon. Or as long as we put them into law relatively soon so that they can start to phase in over time so that we're not either raising people's taxes drastically or cutting people's benefits significantly overnight. What you see here is that this trajectory can't be easily changed. As I mentioned, there are those items like foreign aid or waste, fraud, and abuse that people give as solutions. There's also the slightly larger ones, like just raising taxes on the wealthiest taxpayers or cutting non-defense discretionary spending, that little portion of the budget that we saw in the pie, that can solve this problem. And neither of those are going to get a significant way towards the solution. They can both be a small part of the solution, depending on where you're coming from in terms of your approach, whether you think we should be cutting more domestic programs or raising taxes on higher income people. But neither of them is going to get you the large majority of the way. In order to do that, we need to fix what is shown on this next slide, the healthcare problem, which is that out of all of the spending that you see here in the budget, and this is just the pie chart essentially laid out in a different way and showing you the pieces of the pie, how they're growing in the coming years, we need to solve that healthcare spending line. And that can be done with a whole host of different reforms, and we don't really know which ones of them are necessarily going to be successful and which ones are not. But there are many different types of reforms that have been proposed across the aisle that could be put into place to potentially address that line. And you can see that the other parts of the budget as a percentage of GDP, percentage of the economy, are not scheduled to grow that fast. They're basically, within the next couple decades, all supposed to level off. And that's something that's not necessarily common wisdom, that Social Security does level off like that, because a lot of people talk about how it is going broke, which, quote unquote broke, which is true, that the trust fund is scheduled to run out of money. but it's not what is causing our general budget deficits and debt to be so out of whack. This problem is so large on the healthcare side because a decade from now, there are going to be over 10,000 seniors enrolling in Medicare every business day. And that's a large number, and there are more and more of them as time goes on over the next decade or two, as the baby boomers continue to retire, and they're going to be growing older, and the older that the seniors are on average, the more expensive their medical costs are. And so this is a large part, in addition to the general healthcare inflation in the system, or excess cost growth, that is causing that blue line to be so steep. The other side of the picture is the revenue side, the amount that we collect primarily in taxes, whether they're income taxes or payroll taxes or corporate income taxes. As you can see here, over the 4 years that we had a balanced budget at the end of the 1990s and early 2000s, our revenues as a percentage of the economy were either close to or over 20% of GDP, of the economy. In the next decade, they're projected, if we continue on current policy that is in place now, to be at 18% of GDP. And again, that is if we do not allow tax rates to go up, we keep them as they are today, everything is continued at, that's what we call current policy. The problem is, if we're going to get, our budget picture is even worse than it was in the 90s, and we have all the baby boomers retiring that we just spoke about. So to balance the budget, which we don't even necessarily need to do, but we need to level off our debt as a percentage of the economy. To do that, we can't do it at 18% of GDP, unless spending comes down to relatively close to 18% of GDP. And that's a level that we haven't been in years and years, and as it shows there, the baby boomers is not going to permit us to get to that level. So even if you implement all types of cuts and reforms on the spending side of the budget, we at the Bipartisan Policy Center and most other centrist groups around DC and the country believe that some additional revenues in some shape or form are going to be necessary. And both the Simpson-Bowles Commission and the Domenici-Rivlin plan tackled both the entitlement healthcare and the revenue side of that equation. So that's a general summary of where we are in the current budget debate and the current budget picture as the federal government stands. And I think it's important to take a quick look at how we got to this point. How did we get to a place where our deficits were so large, which I think is largely attributable to some decisions that were made in the previous decade, as well as the financial crisis that we experienced, where revenues went down, income tax receipts went down, and spending went up as we had automatic counter-cyclical, as we call them, programs such as unemployment insurance and food stamps. More people were on those rolls as the recession hit. So that's how we got to those large deficits, but how do we get to the sequester and these budget cuts as we have them today and as they're scheduled to go into effect very shortly? So what I've shown here is a timeline of starting last summer when we had the big debt ceiling fight, where we ultimately got what we call the Budget Control Act, where there was a lot of wrangling that went on all summer, and there was talk of default. And then eventually Congress passed a law, which was signed by the president, called the Budget Control Act. And I should emphasize that although both parties now want to throw this onto the other side, saying that it was all the other side's doing that we came up with this Budget Control Act and the sequester, both parties knew that they were signing on to this legislation. It was passed through both houses of Congress, the Republican-controlled House and the Democratic-controlled Senate, and it was signed by the administration, the president. And so that is how we ended up with the sequester as we do today, because of the failure of the supercommittee last year. They were tasked, as you might remember, to get to a certain level of deficit reduction, $1.2 trillion, and they didn't achieve that goal. And it's said in the law that if that occurred, then starting this coming January 2nd, 9 years of what we call sequestration would go into effect, these automatic across-the-board cuts. The Budget Control Act also included caps for the following 10 years of when that was in place on defense and domestic discretionary spending, or non-defense discretionary spending. I use those two terms interchangeably, non-defense and domestic. But those are the two smaller pieces of the pie that we showed earlier. Those were capped for the next 10 years with relatively stringent limitations, and then the sequester is going to be cutting under those cap levels. So first we restrain them, and now because we failed to find deficit reduction in other parts of the budget or wherever the supercommittee may have found them, we're going to get these automatic cuts. So you can see that we've sort of continually pushed this problem further and further into the future. And an economist that we work with closely at the Bipartisan Policy Center, his name's Donald Marin. He was the acting director of the Congressional Budget Office for a year or two, and he's also been a professor at Georgetown University, and he now runs the Tax Policy Center, which has been in the news a fair amount recently for some of their tax modeling. He has a quote that he gave relatively recently. "It's a shame that can kicking isn't an Olympic sport. Imagine America's elected leaders facing off against their European counterparts in a contest to see who can avoid difficult decisions the longest." I think this characterizes the problems that we've had with our economy and with decision-making in Washington and also across the pond in Europe. And we've eventually reached this point now where we have a decision to make. We have to either let the sequester go into effect, or we have to turn it off or postpone it and replace it with something else. So that gives you, I think, the full context of how we got to the point that we are today. And I think that's important because it allows you to keep in mind what policymakers are thinking about when they are deciding what they're going to do next with the sequester and with other budget and deficit reduction issues. They've come down a long road, and I think a lot of them are tired of that road, and they're looking now what to do next. But now let's focus a little bit on what they have in front of them and what is going to be facing a lot of the grant programs that you all deal with and the federal allocations that are given to universities and programs across the country. So what is a sequester? It's a word that was developed in the 1980s, or a term, I should say, that was developed in the 1980s to describe these automatic across-the-board cuts. And there was a bill passed in 1985 that my boss at the Bipartisan Policy Center actually wrote, so he's very familiar with it, called Graham-Rudman-Hollings. And those were the three co-sponsoring senators, I believe, on the legislation. The Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985. And this was put in place because Congress had a budget issue again. It was a similar problem to what we have today, not quite as large, but they were running large deficits and they needed to get them under control. And so they basically put these automatic cuts into effect. So if the deficit was too large, they would put these cuts in place and it would solve their problem for them if they didn't put in other measures. Phil Gramm, who's one of the co-authors, said, "It was never the objective of Graham-Rudman-Hollings to trigger the sequester. The objective was to have the threat of the sequester force compromise in action." And of course, that's what a lot of lawmakers wanted this sequester to do with the supercommittee. They felt that if they put the sequester as the backstop, the supercommittee would be spurred to action and come up with a bipartisan compromise. But ultimately, that did not come to fruition, and now we're stuck with this problem, this looming problem. And it's important to also note that the 80s and 90s sequesters were not often carried out in full. They were postponed or replaced to some extent or waived, and eventually they spurred Congress to do enough that we got to the place where we were in the 90s, where we were able to achieve these balanced budgets that I mentioned a little bit earlier. But it took a long time. I mean, this is the first balanced budget was in 98, I believe. And so there was 13 years between when they put these sequesters first in place and we got to that eventual point of solution where the problem could be credibly said to be addressed or solved. And I think a lot of people are anticipating that today. It's not going to be an overnight type of fix. So how does this sequester, these automatic across-the-board cuts, work? This diagram shows the breakdown of what I mentioned earlier, $1.2 trillion. They assume that some of that is going to be coming from the interest that we now don't have to pay because we are reducing our debts to some extent by making these cuts in spending. So they put that aside. and then they take $984 billion and divide it equally between defense and non-defense, or domestic discretionary spending. Sorry, I shouldn't say discretionary spending. Some of it goes to mandatory spending, as I'll explain in a second, entitlement spending. But the defense cuts are essentially all to that sliver of defense discretionary spending, that section of the pie. And the non-defense cuts, as you can see there on the furthest left of the blue boxes, the discretionary cuts are roughly $322 billion over the 9 years of the sequester. So the rest of the non-defense cuts come from the mandatory part of the budget. And that's not very much. There's only 170 roughly left over for that large piece of the pie that represents the mandatory and entitlement programs. But you can see there's a limited cut to Medicare. It's limited in the legislation to 2%. And there's cuts to those other mandatory programs. There's some exemptions, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the large chunk of the non-defense cuts go to discretionary spending. So in 2013, fiscal year 2013, which starts on October 1st, or started, I should say, on October 1st and runs through next September 30th, the cuts that the sequester will impose will start on January 2nd of 2013. So it's starting in the middle of a fiscal year. The sequester cuts to the later years after fiscal year 2013, so 2014 through 2021, are actually just a lowering of the cap that, as you may remember, I talked about, they put in place with the Budget Control Act. So they put the caps on defense and domestic spending, and those caps will be reduced for those 8 years, 8 fiscal years, to a significantly lower level that Congress will have to meet. For the first year, there's no planning involved. So that's the difference. For those years, they can plan before October 1st, when the fiscal year starts, to lower certain programs and thus meet the new reduced caps. For 2013, they have no decision-making process. It is automatic across-the-board cuts that will go into place on January 2nd unless they change the law. So it doesn't matter what Congress appropriates. If they decide to try and avoid the sequester this year, or they had, I should say, because they already put in place a continuing resolution, which means they funded the government for this year at the same levels that they did last year as a temporary measure. But it doesn't matter what they appropriate. They could appropriate, $100, and that would all get wiped out by the sequester, because there's a certain level of cuts. It's $55 billion to defense spending and $55 billion to non-defense spending that occur in each year. And that's going to occur no matter what Congress decides to allocate. These cuts in 2013 also happen at what's called the program, project, and activity level. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment, but that's a very granular level of spending. So there's not a lot of flexibility. It's not just saying to the Department of Education, find some way to reduce your spending by this amount. It is saying this individual line item in many cases is going to be cut by a certain amount or a certain percentage. So this is going to be difficult for many accounts that are personnel heavy. So if you have a border patrol agents, for example, where most of that account is likely going to pay the salaries of people who enforce or patrol our borders, their salaries can't just be reduced by a certain amount. There's a law that prevents that. So the government has to find a different way to either reduce those salaries or get the savings in some other manner. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's relatively complicated. There's not an easy fix to that problem. Similarly, if you have a large procurement program, if you're getting 2 Virginia-class submarines next year and you have to find your X dollar cut in that line item, it's very hard to cut a submarine by 8%. So you're going to have to find some way to either postpone the construction or build one this year, build one next year, or find a way to shift the funds around in a manner that I'll talk about momentarily to avoid this. And the flexibility is not significant. So the cuts that are supposed to happen as the law is stated are essentially going to happen. There's no easy way around it. The sequester is also going to produce a lot of unintended consequences and costs directly. So if you procure less of something, whether it's in the defense side or the non-defense side, it's going to cost more on average per unit. If you're getting hundreds of boxes of staples, if you're getting 10% less of them, then the company that you're buying them from may increase the per unit price. An easier example of these costs, unintended costs, are if you're cutting the fund that the IRS uses to pay its informants by a certain amount of money, then presumably you're going to be collecting less money because those informants are now not going to be giving you the information to cut down on tax evasion. So there are these types of effects all across the budget, but you're really not going to save as much money as you're hoping to save by doing these overnight, uncalculated cuts to government spending. So where exactly do the cuts come from in the budget, and what are the percentages? Because those are floating around town, and everyone wants to know what percentage their program is going to be cut by and what they should be anticipating. So I'm going to take a little aside for a moment to explain, and this is involved in that point, but to explain what budget authority and outlays are. Budget authority, this is the complicated way that government spending works, and only us budget nerds in Washington have any day-to-day interaction with it. But some of you in your grant programs probably do have an interaction with it, and you may not realize. So the budget authority is the amount that Congress allocates to a certain program in any given year. So Congress passes its funding for let's say fiscal year 2013, which we're in now, or they pass a continuing resolution, which means they just continued funding from last year, and there's $1 million that they say we're giving to this specific grant program. The outlays from that are how the money is actually spent. So that the law may state, or the way that it's just done by the report that goes along with the bill, that's what explicitly states it, says that if you have $100 million program, then $50 million is going to go out this year, this fiscal year, $30 million will go out the next year, and $20 million will go out in the third year. So $100 million of this year's budget was allocated through budget authority in this year. But the outlays, the actual spending that the government does from that program or from that grant, may be over a series of years. So if they're building an aircraft carrier, they may give budget authority of X million dollars this year, or $1 billion even. But that money could be spent out over the however many years it takes to build that aircraft carrier. And I'm no expert in building aircraft carriers, so I may be extremely off in that estimate. But this is how a hypothetical grant program might work from the federal government. And I'm also not an expert in specific grant programs, so there may be some that work differently than this. But in general, the idea is that the pace that Congress allocates the money is different from how it gets spent. That may be drawn out over a period. This is important. I'll come back to it a little bit later in the presentation, but for how the sequester cuts will impact grant programs such as ones that universities or medical professions are affiliated with. This chart shows where, again, this is sort of a modified version of the pie chart that you saw earlier. It includes tax expenditures, which is a side point, but we consider the tax expenditures like the mortgage interest deduction and the employer-sponsored health insurance exclusion to be spending through the tax code. It has the economic equivalent of direct spending. And they're put in the place of tax reduction. So if you have a mortgage, you can write off a certain amount of your taxes with the interest that you're paying on that. And that would be the same as giving somebody a direct spending program of, if you have a mortgage, where the government's going to give you X amount of money to offset some of the interest that you're paying. So we've included that here in the budget picture to show that none of the automatic cuts that are going into effect are affecting the tax side of the equation. They are almost all on the defense and domestic discretionary sides, $55 billion a year from defense and $39 billion a year from domestic discretionary, and then a tiny bit from mandatory, which includes all of those large programs, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and some of the smaller entitlement programs. But it's very disproportionately weighted on the pieces of the budget that, as we saw at the beginning, are not really the drivers of our economic debt problem. As I said before, there are certain programs that are exempt from the sequester, that are explicitly stated in the law that will not be cut. These are primarily entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicaid, food stamps, other low-income programs, on the mandatory, other low-income entitlement programs. But almost all of discretionary funding is subject. There's a couple small programs here, including Pell Grants, and when I say small, I mean relatively small in the federal budget, Pell Grants, veterans spending, and others that are exempt on the discretionary side. But most non-defense discretionary or domestic discretionary programs are subject, which are most of the grant programs that you probably are dealing with. Also, programs like WIC, the Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, extended unemployment benefits, if those are continued at the end of this year, those would be cut by the sequester. So there's a lot of delicate programs here that are in this pool of funding cuts. And of course, every program in NDD, non-defense discretionary, has its constituency, but there's a lot of low-income programs in there that disproportionately benefit low-income people. A lot of our research programs, as you all know, are in that category. Those are not exempt from the sequester, and the impacts are going to be very real on the ground. If a community is expecting it to get a grant to do something next year and the sequester goes into effect, they very well might not be able to do that. They might have to postpone it, cancel it, etc. I'll go through this slide very quickly, but these are just the assumptions that we use to make our calculations about the percentage cuts that are going to take place next year as a result of the sequester. The one that I should really draw your attention to is the bottom one there, that the sequester starts on January 2nd, which, as I pointed out, is a quarter of the way through the fiscal year, 2013, which started on October 1st. So we assume that 25% roughly of government spending for the calendar year is going to already have been obligated or allocated by that point. And that funding, if it's already been signed away or out the door, is not subject to the sequester. So if they've made a contract to build an aircraft carrier with a defense contractor, that money is not subject to being cut by the sequester. And OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, which is in charge of government spending and the sequester, has said that they've told their agencies not to change their spending rates as a result of the sequester. Now, there are reports that some of them are doing it to some extent still to plan in advance, but by and large, we're under the assumption that they are generally continuing spending at normal rates for the first quarter of this year. That means that the cuts all occur in 3 quarters of a fiscal year, meaning that they're going to be that much more severe over that period of time. So we estimate that the cuts will be as follows, percentage-wise. The defense cut for the 3 quarters of the year will be approximately 12.5% of that funding. Similarly, on the domestic discretionary side, which includes, again, all the grant programs that we're talking about, it's going to be approximately an 11% cut. If you do this on an annualized basis, so if you're looking at the full allocation or budget authority that Congress has given for a specific program, like a community block grant, and that's, let's say, $10 billion, then that will get cut by 8.2% because that's the full year amount. But if you take 75% of that, 3 quarters of the year, so 7.5 billion, that number that's left, or that we assume is left, and of course that's a simplifying assumption, is going to get cut by the higher percentage of roughly 11%. And then mandatory programs will get approximately a 10% cut over the 3-quarter year basis. I should emphasize, and we'll come back to this, that it's impossible to know what percentage cut your individual grant program, your individual grant is going to receive under the sequester. And that's due to a couple issues that we'll discuss in the next section, or in the coming section of the presentation. But while we can know the general picture, we're not going to know what the individual impacts are going to be for specific line item programs for some time, probably not until it goes into effect, if it goes into effect. What's important is that the interpretation and implementation of the sequester are ultimately up to OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. Unless Congress writes a new law, they will be the ones making these decisions of how to interpret the across-the-board cuts in the law. So what are the impacts going to be? And first we'll look at the macroeconomic impacts, and then some more of the individual impacts to programs that you all are working with and such. But the general impacts are going to be pretty severe. So you see here a graph of non-defense discretionary spending from today to 2021, when all the sequester years have gone into effect. And it's significantly below, by 2021, the historic low as a percentage of the economy. So that pot of spending that we call domestic discretionary is going to be far below what it's ever been before as a percentage of our economy, at least in the modern era, I should clarify. So not going back to 1776. But as you see there with the purple line, even the original caps that we talked about that were put on domestic spending in the Budget Control Act would take us below our historic low as a percentage of the economy. The sequester is far below that. So, even if you are one for a smaller federal government and cutting domestic discretionary spending, I think it's important that everyone be aware that we are significantly below where we have been historically, especially the average that you see up there with the green line. What's funny is that you can give this exact same graph, and I haven't done it because we're not focusing on defense spending here. The graph for defense looks almost identical. So some people primarily on the other side of the aisle will say defense has grown out of proportion and we need to cut back on the money that we're spending on our national security and defense. That level too has gone below what the historical low as a percentage of our economy has been, will go below the historical low if we implement the sequester. So we're talking about low levels of spending. Yet we have this huge budget problem that we're all talking about. The reason for that is, as we keep bringing up, the problem is not in defense and non-defense discretionary spending. It's in the other entitlement portions of the budget and revenues. So most analysts that look at this suggest that the sequester is misdirected at the problem. In terms of economic growth next year, we have made these calculations based off of Congressional Budget Office figures, and it's going to be relatively significant. It's going to take about 0.5% off of our economic growth, which is already only projected to be right now at around 2%. As you see, the average growth in recoveries from recessions is much higher than that. Of course, there's a whole other discussion to be had about why growth is so low. Some people are pointing their fingers at the president in the election season. Others are pointing their fingers at the fact that financial crisis recoveries are usually slower. But the matter of fact is that we are still projected to be significantly struggling in the recovery as of next year, and this will take us below that projected level if the cuts go into effect. On the job side, this is similar. We are projected to add roughly 4 million jobs over the next 2 years. This will take away about 1 million of them by our estimates. And this isn't fear-mongering or anything like that. This is actually what the economic figures show when you do the hard calculations, because of the aggressive overnight nature of the cuts and taking all that money out of the economy in a difficult economy, in a slow-growing economy, will cost the country a lot of jobs in the short term. This is one of my favorite slides in the presentation because it shows that after all of this pain that we've talked about and all of the nonsensical across-the-board cuts that we're doing to try to get our debt and deficits under control, we've made almost no change in that trajectory that you saw at the beginning. This is basically a version of the same line, except starting today and moving forward instead of the historical debt line that you saw at the beginning. And that green line is what the new trajectory would be if we let the sequester go into effect. So we would postpone the point at which the federal government hits debt that exceeds the size of our economy by 2 years. And the trajectory is exactly the same. So, as I mentioned, there are some issues that have yet to be resolved as to why we can't determine what the size of the cuts will be to individual programs. And I think it's important to understand these in brief, and I'm going to go through them pretty quickly, just to have an idea of what we're looking out for over the coming months, and if the sequester does go into effect, to determine how these cuts will hit at the local level. So there's 3 reasons. The first is program, project, and activity. That's PPA again. That's the level that the cuts are supposed to be at in the sequester. But there's no exact definition for what program, project, and activity means. It's not like, this is a program, like food stamps, which are exempt, are a program, or something else is a project that the federal government's working on. This is a defined level called the PPA level, which in many cases means a line item level, the lowest level of spending you can get to. But it's not defined in a lot of agencies in their appropriations bills. So the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, in collaboration with the agencies, has to work out what these PPA cuts mean. So why don't we just look back to the 1980s, for an example, for how they did it back then, and see what they did with their PPA level, and that'll give us a good interpretation of what it will be today. The problem is that the Government Accountability Office, in a report as to how the sequesters in the 1980s were carried out, said that this was basically chaos, is I think paraphrasing the term that they used. Nobody had any idea what was going on after the sequester was implemented. So everyone was scrambling around, the OMB with the agencies, to try to figure out how these PPA cuts would be implemented. So basically they didn't have any better idea than we do today. And even when, after they had determined them, the GAO found that there were multiple inconsistencies with how these were carried out, and that there were undefined terms in the law as to how it should be applied in certain places. So there's really no place to look as to precedent for what's going to occur. It's likely going to be the same chaotic process. I think there's a longer period that OMB has to prepare for this, so they can be working intensely with the agencies now to try to figure this out. But it's going to be a very messy process because there are different definitions in certain appropriations bills for certain agencies, and even within agencies, there are different definitions across different areas of their budgets. This will matter, again, as to the amount of flexibility that an agency has in carrying these cuts out. So if it's at a line item level, the lowest level possible, then there's nowhere that they can, within at least what we're talking about now, that they can move the funds. It's determined at that line item, that percentage cut will occur. If it's at an account level, so at a group of activities or a group of programs in the budget, then they have flexibility as to do they want to cut this smaller area more and this one less. They have a little bit of breathing room. But either way, it's not going to be a lot and it's not going to be pretty. So we sort of touched on this point already, that agencies might slow down obligations to have more flexibility within their PPAs as to how they make those cuts and how they spread them out. But OMB stated that they're instructing the agencies not to do this. Some reports say that they are, as I mentioned earlier, but they've put on record policy that says that they should not. The second issue that is pending as to why we can't know what the cuts are going to be at the individual level is there are mechanisms called reprogramming and transfer authority that Congress has on a regular basis to change the amounts that Congress has given them. And the agencies can do reprogramming, which means moving funds within a budget account. So if a budget account, for example, is operations and maintenance for the Navy, They can move money from the salaries to whatever other gas purchases. They can move money back and forth within the budget account, and they just need sign off from members of Congress to do that from the committee chairs, the relevant committee chairs. For transfer authority, which is to move funds across budget accounts, that's limited in the legislation that's passed by Congress. So they have some ability to move money from maybe the operations and maintenance of the Navy to operations and maintenance of the Army, but that's relatively small. And similarly on the domestic side. So there are these two means by which the agencies and OMB will have some flexibility to move the funds around. But again, it's very small. But because of this, we don't know exactly, when we're dealing with individual grant programs or individual allocations, exactly what the cuts will be and the percentages. The third, and this is an issue that's going to come up increasingly as we get closer to the sequester. I don't politically prognosticate very much, but this is the one thing that I will say, is that increasingly people are going to be talking about how OMB can just delay the sequester by telling agencies, keep spending like you usually do. We will deal with the sequester cuts later in the fiscal year, so we'll still get the cuts. And that's because we're assuming that Congress is going to act in the interim. So they'll do something in February or March to address this. But that's dangerous because there are actual risks. If Congress doesn't address it, then at the end of the year, you're going to have no money left because you've continued spending as usual. And so your 10% cut, or whatever the exact percentage cut is going to come at the end of the year, and you're now going to have no money to run your government at the end of the year. That's an extreme scenario, but that's the type of issue that you get into if you get into this process. Also, there's the perceived risk that people think the cuts are going to affect even if they aren't even if the OMB is trying to keep spending money closer to the usual rate. So there's the impact that it'll have on businesses' reactions and the economic ramifications, even if OMB tries to use this mechanism. And there's also a limit on how much they can do with something called the Anti-Deficiency Act, where they can't spend funds that Congress hasn't appropriated or spend funds substantially faster than Congress has allowed them to spend. But this will be an increasing political topic as we get close to the end of the year in the sequester. So very quickly, how will the cuts affect particular domestic programs? And as I just mentioned, the short answer is we're unsure. But this is an example. If the across-the-board cuts were implemented proportionally, then these non-defense programs would be cut by the amounts that you see in the right-hand column. And that's an 11% cut. So it's significant amounts of money, whether it's the NIH grants or grants for scientific research and all other sorts of programs that are sensitive, such as special ed or primary and secondary education. These are all facing relatively significant cuts compared to the size of their budget. For funding that is related to the university grant programs, you can look at the account level, which is at a broader level of government spending, rather than necessarily the PPA level, which is where the sequester will be implemented. You can go to that website, which is the OMB's report that they put out recently, to show what the cuts will be at the account level. This is basically just going to show what I'm telling you in this presentation, which is whatever account your program is under, unless it's somehow exempt, which again, there are very few exceptions in this area of spending. It's going to be cut by that 9% or whatever for the full year that we were talking about earlier. In some cases, and I'm not going to go in detail into this right now, but grant funding could be hit harder because government personnel, there are certain provisions that basically make it harder to cut those than grant funding. So if the PPA is at a certain program level that has a grant in it and funding for personnel that administer that grant, let's say, and I don't know this to be the case for any specific grant programs, but if that's the case, they're going to be more likely to have to take the funds out of the grant itself than out of the personnel who are administering the grant. So that could cause a disproportionate impact on the programs. Coming back to this budget authority versus outlays, how the how the money is allocated, and then how it is actually spent out by or distributed by the federal government. So let's take an example that a grantee, again, is given $1 million each year. So it's a regular grant that they give, and Congress authorizes it each year, allocates it each year. And it goes in the outlays: $500,000 in the first year, $300,000 in the second year, and $200,000 in the third year. So if you have this grant, $1 million in 2011, $1 million in 2012, and $1 million in 2013, in fiscal year 2013, or 2013 calendar year, you are receiving your $200,000 from your 2011 grant, $300,000 from a 2012 grant, and $500,000 from a 2013 grant. Only the $500,000 from the 2013 grant is being cut by that percentage of the sequester. The old budget authority that is just now turning into outlays and being actually distributed to spend is not cut. So this is one mitigating factor, and again, this is not to understate the amount of pain that the sequester will cause or the impact that the sequester will have, but not all funding that the government is given out is going to be subject to this cut, because a lot of it was given out or authorized in earlier years. So that's important to keep in mind. If you have grant programs that were authorized earlier but that are just now spending out, that only the new funds that you're receiving this year as an allocation are subject to these cuts. So, to finish up very quickly, we've seen what the budget situation looks like and a lot about what the mechanics and details of the sequester are. So the question on a lot of people's minds in Washington, and for a lot of you probably across the country, are what do we do now? What is Congress looking to do now? Tell me how this is going to end up. And unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for you, and the news doesn't look good recently. What many of you may have heard about is the Fiscal Cliff, which is not only the sequester, which is part of the Fiscal Cliff, but it's a series of automatic measures that are going into effect at the end of this calendar year, or mostly at the very beginning of the next calendar year, that will reduce spending and increase taxes that will actually cut the budget deficit. So in that narrow sense, it helps our long-term debt problems. But in terms of the economic impact, it could be very damaging, because that's a lot of fiscal contraction, which is what we call deficit cutting, in a very short period of time. So here you see it laid out on a calendar schedule. On this slide here, you see it laid out on an amount that these programs cost. So you've got your tax, the Bush tax cuts expiring, which is, for the deficit is great. It'll reduce the deficit projected next year by over $300 billion. But that's a lot of tax increases to a relatively delicate economy. And you've got spending cuts, the sequester. You've got, I'm not going to go into it, but what we call the doc fix, which are cuts to healthcare provider payments. And then on top of all this, so this sums to over $600 billion in austerity next year, fiscal contraction. And you've got the debt ceiling coming up, which we think is going to have to be dealt with at the very beginning of next year. So you've got basically a mess. And this all has to be dealt with, essentially, aside from the debt ceiling, in the lame duck session of Congress, which is what we call when they come back from the election and many members have been voted out and people are trying to get new committee chairmanships or leadership positions in both parties, and people are running around with like chickens with their heads cut off, trying to figure out all sorts of different issues that pertain to them, whether it's the committees or the leadership, or whether they're clearing out their offices. Some members get moved down to the basement to be cleared out next year if they got voted out of office. So you've got a lot of unhappy members and members that want to get home for the holidays at the end of this year. And that may sound silly, but that's actually the reality of what the lame duck sessions are like in Washington. And in that context, they have to deal with this. So what we have so far is we have a House Republican bill that has eliminated at least the defense part, and I believe some of the non-defense part of the sequester for next year with basically more cuts to domestic spending. So they've shifted the defense cuts to different areas of the domestic budget. In short, this is not palatable for Democrats in Washington. They've rejected this. The president, I believe, has said if it got to his desk, he would veto it. The Senate's not planning on taking it up, so it's a non-starter. Similarly, Senate Democrats and President Obama are saying that we need revenues to be a part of the mix, specifically high-income tax increases. So let the Bush tax cuts expire for the wealthy. And the House has taken a pretty strong stand that they are, at least at this point, not ready to agree to that. And so what you've got is both sides saying, we're waiting for a proposal from the other side. But in fact, the other side is saying the same thing. So you've got a stalemate that both sides just stand there waving up the proposal that they have passed or that they are recommending, that the other side has already told them that they're not going to listen to. So there's a political gridlock that you hear about on many issues today in Washington that needs to be resolved before the end of this year, or else all of these fiscal cliff items, including the sequester, will go into effect. To end on a not-so-dour note, there are some members who we are working with that are looking to solve the problem. And these are relatively moderates on both sides of the aisle who realize how large a hit this would be for the economy and how dangerous this is, and want to come up with a serious solution that gives some of what both parties are asking for, but not all. And we have some optimism that this will work out in the end, but the people that I work closely with believe that there is at least roughly a 50% chance that this could go into effect at the end of this year. And then there's a possibility that Congress will come back and retroactively fix some of it at the beginning of next year, but that's a messy process. So I think at this point, people need to be at least aware of the impending sequester and preparing for what it could mean for individual programs or grant work that you and others are doing, and hope and lobby Congress to address it. But the situation right now is not great, and we are doing our best to try to get Congress to implement something, and we are hoping that they do. So I hope that gives a good summary and overview of what we are looking at for next year with the sequester, and what the dangers it poses are, and how it could individually impact many of your programs and the research that you're doing on the individual level. So I'd be happy to take any questions at this point that you all may have.
Thank you, Shai. If anyone has any questions about sequestration, please send your questions to federalupdate@missouri.edu. This was a pretty complicated subject, so take a little bit of time and send in your questions. Again, that email address is federalupdate@missouri.edu. I have a question. There's a lot of uncertainty about this. Is it going to happen? Is it not going to happen? When it happens, if it happens, how will it be implemented? Is there anything realistic that institutions can do to prepare themselves?
So there's one very simple and potentially significant answer, which is on the political side, which is that if you do not want these cuts to go into effect, you should call your member of Congress, as you are often told by many that are lobbying for various issues, to tell them that you do not believe these cuts should go into effect and that they should work together to replace them. If there's enough of a grassroots effort, then that may be successful. If it's not, and even in the case of it eventually being successful, but still dealing with the uncertainty that we are right now, I think it's prudent to take into account when you are making your grant requests and when you are anticipating how much funding you will have for any specific program next year, that the government agencies that you're dealing with are going to have this on their hands and not going to have a whole lot of discretion as to how the cuts take place. And so planning your activities for a lower level of funding in many cases is probably prudent, at least having a backup plan. I don't know exactly what that means for each person's individual grant programs or activities that they're using federal funds for, but there's at least a decent chance that you will not see the usual allocation. And this is in addition to the fact that that non-defense discretionary part of the budget has been getting squeezed recently and will continue to over the next decade. So even if we don't have the sequester, funds are going to be tight because of general deficit reduction and the caps that they put on this type of spending with the Budget Control Act. So whether your individual program is deemed a priority and actually increased is a possibility, but overall the average is going to be towards a trend of restraint in this area of funding.
Okay, thank you. Again, if you have questions, please send them to federalupdate@missouri.edu. You were talking about the personnel provisions. In that possibility, is it possible that agencies might cover their own internal people first and just stop funding entirely? Or is that not a realistic possibility?
So I don't think that agencies can stop funding for programs entirely. They may be able to not issue a certain grant that they usually issue. And that may be the case, that some agencies may decide to do that in particular instances. What I was referring to with the personnel is that federal personnel cannot be given pay cuts. So we can't take a 10% pay cut to everybody in the Department of Education and solve the problem like that. They also have very strict rules in terms of laying people off and furloughing people, which means short-term, telling people don't come in this week, don't come in this month. I think if they say that for more than a month, then they're actually laying people off, which is called a RIF, or reduction in force, which has very specific regulations of how that takes place. And it's also stated in this year's funding, general congressional funding, that the personnel funds get priority. And it's debatable as to what exactly this means, but in many instances, they are going, when the agencies and OMB are looking at how to make those cuts on the line items or on the PPAs, they're going to say, we're not going to be reducing our personnel by this amount. Instead, we may have to cut grants by 15% on average instead of the 10%. And I think that's going to be realistic for some places. In certain areas like Department of Treasury, for example, most of their budget may be personnel. So they may be required to make reductions or at least decrease their personnel through attrition or through not putting up new job postings for certain positions that they were otherwise anticipating to need. But I don't see them being able to shift all the funds from personnel, but in short, there will probably be some shift off of the personnel side to the programmatic side.
Okay, thank you. Again, questions, please send them to federalupdate@missouri.edu. I have a question here. If sequestration goes into effect, although it plays out over several years, can it be stopped and the damage repaired midstream in 2013 after the elections?
So that's a very good question. And I alluded to that a little bit earlier, but it's not a pretty possibility. So when we say that could the damage be stopped or fixed, I think the right answer is that we don't know. There could be a lot of economic damage caused just by the fact that the cuts are anticipated to go into effect and the uncertainty that this is all causing. And again, not just the sequester, but the rest of the fiscal cliff, the tax increases and other spending cuts. But in terms of restoring funds, that can be done. So if you have a grant program that was supposed to receive $10 million and it got $1 million cut off because of the sequester, then that $1 million, Congress could say, we're getting rid of the sequester and we're going to allow the agency to tack it back on in March. So you may get that $1 million later than you were anticipating it, and it may be delayed. There might be other consequences, but it can be restored if Congress decides to do that. And similarly, for the later years that haven't yet occurred, it could be turned off. Those cuts just won't happen. But in terms of the economic damage, companies are making decisions now, especially in the private sector, as to what they're going to do as a result of the sequester. And you've heard some stuff in the news about mass layoffs at defense companies, and those now are not anticipated to happen. They're going to wait and see a little bit, but eventually these companies need to make decisions based on what projects they think are in the pipeline. And if the sequesters hit and there's no resolution immediately in sight, they're going to have to make investment and hiring decisions at that point that probably can't be easily rectified. If you lay somebody off, your technical engineer, it's not going to be that easy to find. You can't just tell them 3 months later they probably found another job, hopefully. that they're now working at, and you can't just pull them back into your company. You need to go out and do a whole new hiring process. So this is a microcosm of what it will be like across the economy. So I think some of the damage can be repaired, some of it won't be, and the problem is the uncertainty. We don't know what parts of the damage will and will not be able to be repaired.
I was just going to add to that, there's been a lot of discussion at the federal level about how do you promote research by junior faculty members, people who are just getting into the research game. And if something like this hits and someone's just started as an assistant professor, I can't imagine what it's going to be like in the next couple of years facing this great uncertainty and the cuts. So again, any questions, please feel free to send them to federalupdate@missouri.edu. Just want to pass on a compliment, actually, from one of our viewers. Wanted to say kudos on this presentation. You made this very complicated topic understandable, so thank you very much. Any last questions out there? Federalupdate@missouri.edu. Should you have some time to look at the slides later, if questions occur to you, please always feel free to send them to federalupdate@missouri.edu. We'll make sure that they get to Shai so that he can answer your questions. And also his contact information is part of his slide presentation. So you can also feel free to direct any questions to him. I just want to say thank you very much for being here. This was incredibly informative and somewhat scary at the same time. And we really appreciate you coming out. So
thank you very much for having me, and I apologize for all our viewers for the complexity of the information. Unfortunately, that's the sequester that we were dealt.
Thank you. And everyone, just so you know, if you haven't looked at the website online, we are starting tomorrow at a slightly modified schedule due to Hurricane Sandy. Our first speaker tomorrow is going to be Eric Rolfing from the Department of Energy Office of Science, and he is going to speak with us at 8:30 a.m. Central Time, 9:30 Eastern Time, and we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you very much.